Hello, listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker, Casey, and I just wanted to briefly highlight that I've been suffering for a few weeks with my sinuses and with my throat, so I wanted to put out an apology for any hoarse or nasally audio that some of you might have recognised. As some of you may know, we run a monthly memoir giveaway across social media every month on the podcast, but I've been relatively quiet on social media platforms lately. So I'll be extending October's giveaway of Helen Zuman's Mating in Captivity memoir, an insightful book about Helen's time in a group called Zendik who had a radical take on society, sex and relationships. Helen has been in touch to ask if anyone who has read the book would be willing to head over to Amazon or Goodreads and leave a review. Just a few words or sentences that should take less than 5 minutes. I've already submitted mine in the hopes of continuing to promote Helen's fantastic book, and anyone who has entered the giveaway in October will have their names automatically rolled over into November as we continue the giveaway across a new month. All you have to do is follow, like, and comment or share any content across November that you find on my social media accounts at Cult Vault Pod on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. At the start of December, I will announce a new winner and send across your copy of Mating in Captivity. I'll leave a link to Helen's book in the episode description. Today I chat with Jared about Seventh-day Adventism. This is something new on the show, so we briefly discuss how the faith was founded and how it has developed and changed through time. We also discuss Jared's personal experiences growing up in this faith before deciding to leave it behind. Now, I'm no expert in this field whatsoever, so please know that some of the things that I have said in this episode might not be factual or correct. Although I do always try and research beforehand, some details could be wrong. I do digress and hope that the information is in order, but for now, here is Jared. So hello, Jared, and thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me today. I am not too familiar with Adventism, so I am really looking forward to hearing your story today. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Hi, I'm Jared. I'm an ex-Adventist who was born and raised in the Adventist Church. I live in the United States. I've lived all over the United States after college, but I spent most of my time in Adventism in my youth.
And is this something that you were born into?
Yes, I was born and raised into it. My parents were into it. My mother was born into it. My father went through a mail order evangelist program where they would send you multiple packets to study, and you'd read the Bible, study them, and you fill out questionnaires and send them back in. He did that in the 50s and 60s. And I think it was partially on the urging of his step-grandfather, because his parents didn't even go to church. His stepfather did, but his grandmother didn't either. So he kind of had one foot in more or less because he convinced himself.
Wow, I've never heard of a mail order evangelist program. Is that something that still exists today?
Yeah, oh yes, you can still get it. I think Amazing Facts, which is probably the main Adventist evangelist programming and series, still has mail order packets you can get.
And does this pair you with the religion that best suits the answers that you give in those questionnaires?
No, it's more trying to convince you of the end of world conspiracies based on studying Revelation,
Right.
Daniel, and then going through a lot of Catholic histories, and quoting specific things from the Catholic histories, and trying to use them to justify their interpretation of those end of world prophecies.
Right. Wow, that is fascinating and something that I'm definitely going to have to look into a bit more. Do you know how your mother and father met inside the church?
Yes, so they met at somewhat through an Adventist college. However, my dad was friends with her brothers. And so you could say it was through the college, but it was also through family as well.
Okay. So even though your father kind of found his own path into the church, he was surrounded by people who were already familiar with the faith themselves.
Eventually, yes.
Right.
Eventually, he chose to go to an Adventist school after attending state school.
Oh, and that's how he met your mum's brothers and then your
Yep.
mother. Right.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Brilliant. So, how many children did your parents go on to have? Is it just yourself?
And one sister.
Oh, okay. Okay. And what are just in a brief sentence, what are her affiliations with the faith currently?
Oh, she's in it hook, line, and sinker.
Right. Okay. Okay. Interesting. So, can you break down the religion for us in terms of the core principles and practices of Adventism?
Yeah. So it spawned out of Methodism. So if you go to a Saturday church meeting, you'll notice the format and even the hymnals are exactly like you see in a Methodist church, because it's a direct offshoot of Methodism. Only they took some of the strangest things from Judaism. They have a prophet like Mormonism, and they have some contention over the Trinity like Jehovah's Witnesses do. So I like to describe it as if you took Mormonism, Judaism, and Jehovah's Witnesses and you stirred it all up, that is a lot like Adventism. The thing that you have at the end, though, is everything is focused around Saturday being the true Sabbath, and the whole end of the world will happen because people will be forced to go to church on Sunday.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
really interesting. Oh my goodness. Okay, so typically in most Christian sects and branches and even most Catholic branches, that church is on Sundays. So Adventism, to set itself aside from the majority of most of the Christian sects, its prophecy is that if you do go to church on a Sunday, that will cause the end of the world.
Yeah, that does. And it's a very, they only really had access to the King James version in the United States. And so they're looking at it in the 19th century, when there was a wave of I would call evangelical Christian movements.
Mm-hmm.
You saw a lot of summer camp meetings. You saw a lot of new religions starting. Mormonism is one of them. A lot of Baptists. So Adventism spawned out of that, out of really looking at the Bible and trying to have as literal interpretation as they could, but ignoring a lot of the contradictions that the Bible had. So there's another core concept of Adventism is the second coming of Christ and the belief in life after death. So Adventists don't believe when you die that you're going to automatically go to heaven. They believe when you die, you are dead until Christ comes and resurrects you from the dead. And then you would go to heaven as a fully bodied form.
Right. Okay. The most fascinating thing for me when I am speaking to guests that have these different insights around various faiths, especially within this kind of the Bible Belt of America, it's fascinating how during this kind of period in time that you mentioned, the 19th century, with all these different with the revivals and things that happened where significant figures broke away from mainstream faith and decided to create their own sort of fringe beliefs, they have all looked at the same text and interpreted it in such a different way, and that is essentially the only thing that makes them different from the majority of other religions that study the same text. And sometimes it's as simple as church on Saturdays or the difference in resurrection. And to me, it's just so interesting. And I imagine as well that they all sat round a table and certain people disagreed with the majority and said, well, I don't agree with that, so I'll just go off and start my own religion based on what I
Oh,
believe.
and not only that, for decades, there was disagreement over whether Adventism would accept the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. It was not fully accepted into the canon of beliefs until 1931.
So pretty, in terms of religion, pretty recently.
Yes, very recently. And I just learned that on a ex-Adventist subreddit. And I had to go look it up myself from Andrews University, a Adventist university in Michigan. Yeah, totally true. And there's still, I think, a lot of debate over that as well. I think that's partially how this other sect, the Branch Davidians, they kind of start around that same time as sort of they're definitely splinter, and they believed that I think another Christ was going to come, and that the first Jesus wasn't the real Jesus. There's yet a Jesus to come. So
I've looked into the Branch Davidians, and it seemed to be almost like an upside down pyramid. And if you put the Branch Davidians at the bottom, you've got this big revival happening at the top, and then it branches, it like trickles down with Ellen G. White, like kind of being one of those people that sits at the table and says, like, I disagree with you, so I'm going to go off and create my own faith. And then from there, there's a couple of other notable figures that broke away from Ellen G. White or took over when she passed away, who then have that same disagreement and say, no, I'm going to go off and start my, and it kind of happens 2 or 3 times until you get down to David Koresh at the bottom with the Branch Davidians, who in some capacity do still exist today, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more as we get into the episode. But is that kind of, is that, as an outsider's perspective, would you say that's pretty accurate on how the church was founded?
yes, yeah.
And what do you know about Ellen G. White herself?
Oh, I've read several of her books as well as the histories of her. I know when she was a little girl, she was hit in the head by a rock and out cold for days. People thought she was going to die. And then afterwards, that's when her visions, or what I would more likely call seizures, started to happen, where she started writing down a lot of what she saw or believed. But as I've grown older, I've realized a lot of what she wrote down were plagiarized from other people's works. So, and she's a very controversial figure, even in the church itself. Right now, there are Adventists who wholeheartedly believe in her, and there are Adventists who are like, she shouldn't even be part of the message. We shouldn't even be talking.
Wow, so a lot of contention within the church itself. Yep. At the moment. There seems to be like a lot of us versus them already coming through in just a short amount of the in time we've been speaking, in sort of the us versus them church on Saturdays versus church on Sundays, us versus them kind of Adventists versus non-Adventists. And then even within the church, you've got the us versus them aspect of people that follow Ellen G. White's teachings to people who think that church should move away from the things that she practiced and the things that she taught. And seeing as this faith was founded by a woman, does that mean that this particular faith is more progressive for women in terms of positions of power?
No, women are still not allowed to be ministers. It's what's the craziest thing. It's still being argued about, and they're still not officially allowed to be ministers, even though the founder, the main prophet, is a woman. It just kind of blows your mind.
So there we go back to an earlier thing that we mentioned about how a lot of these faiths seem to be very similar, about apart from 1 or 2 things that sets them aside. So being more progressive around equal rights is not something that sets Adventism aside from things like Jehovah's Witnesses or Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, interesting. And when you said that you had read some of Ellen G. White's work, is this propaganda that you are encouraged to read when you're a practicing member of the faith, or is this something you went to read off of your own kind of interest and want for further knowledge?
Both. It was both, and they were, pretty difficult things to read, but they did try to cite sources, and I even went and looked at some of the sources, like the Catholic Bible, and there's a Catholic encyclopedia they like to source, and a few other things, but I did it on my own.
Okay, and it's and a thought that I think is important to mention is that you read something on the ex-Adventist subreddit that you had to then go and research, and it was quite difficult to corroborate this piece of information that you'd read. And I think
it wasn't difficult. Oh no, it was okay. Right on Andrews University's website. Boom, they explained the whole situation. They explained the voting committee members on. They had a committee to vote on the Trinity in the 30s, the 20s and 30s, because they had been arguing over it for so long. Yeah,
that's yeah. And I guess the point that I would make in that case then is that you only found out this information so far into your life, when you would think it would be something that was taught about the history of the movement to members quite early on.
Well, that's something they wouldn't really want to teach that, because a lot of other religions don't really see Adventism as, I think, Christian. And that would definitely be something they could latch on to say that.
And what
they keep that hush hush.
Yeah, I think that's probably the point that I was hoping to make, and you've summarized it perfectly for me there. So thank you for helping me with that particular thought. But why do you think it is that a lot of other religions or new religious movements don't see Adventism as a true Christian movement?
I think a lot of it has to do with not accepting a lot of the founding principles of the New Covenant, where they rejected a lot of the Judaic practices, like eating certain types of meat, going to church on Saturday, accepting, this essentially three-headed God.
Mm-hmm.
Because Adventism still uses a lot of those Judaic practices, they are kind of rejecting that New Covenant of accepting a Messiah-based movement. I think that would be really some of the main ones.
Mm-hmm.
Those are traditions that were decided thousands of years ago. And here Adventism comes along and says, nope, we're still going to do some of the Jewish practices, but we're going to pick and choose which ones we want.
Yeah, absolutely. And what can you tell us about the faith that has changed since its implementation up until today?
That's a good one. I think what's progressing since implementation to today is the Adventist health message. They like to pride themselves on being the longest lived people in the United States, because a lot of them choose to be vegan or vegetarian.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have a lot of hospitals, yet now you're seeing a big schism with vaccinations in COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really driving a wedge. Kind of like the United States is politically, you have people who are extremely anti-vaccine. They think that if they eat a certain way and they live a certain way, these diseases aren't going to affect them. And then you have the others, specifically the ones that are more associated with the hospitals, who are like, no, we absolutely need to have vaccines. This is a pandemic.
Yeah.
We've had vaccines ever since the modern era started. You guys are crazy. But then the crazy part then goes, no, these vaccines are a mark of the beast. Those are going to be the end times if we get a vaccine. And it just spirals from there. And so I'm seeing this big divide developing, and kind of like the United States political divide between Adventist anti-vaxxers and Adventist, pro-science vaccinators.
And where do you stand in terms of vaccines or no vaccines?
Oh, I'm pro-vaccine.
Me too. I've had both my jabs, which I'm happy about. I always think it's an interesting question to ask. Obviously, we are lucky to be able to practice free will, so it would be very interesting for me to have a guest on one day who says that they aren't pro-vaccine, and then we can have a nice discussion about that. And I would really appreciate to learn their insight as to why. But obviously that's not today, because we have another pro vaccinator here. So more divide then within the church here in terms of pro vaccinations and anti-vaccinations. And I don't think that's unique to Adventism, from what I can see in terms of the religious movements in America, congregations still meeting up in the hundreds without any face masks and no social distancing, disrespecting lockdown regulations, because they have the protection of their Lord and Savior, versus people who shut themselves away for months trying to protect themselves and the people they love by actually adhering to those lockdown restrictions. So I don't know if that particular take is unique to Adventism, but what is interesting is what you said about the scaremongering around the mark of the beast, and how if people do go and get the vaccine, they're kind of inviting themselves in to become ill or taken over, and that I don't think is a particularly fair way to approach things.
No, well, and it's also ironic that they post this type of information on a device that is tracking everything they do and tracks where they are, their cell phones.
That's something that I hadn't even thought about. As an outsider looking over at America at the moment, it's very interesting to see shifts and divides all over the country since the election, since the progression of the QAnon movement, since the breakout of the virus worldwide. It seems as if there are so many differing opinions on almost everything in America at the moment. Nobody can seem to agree exactly on anything at all.
Mm-hmm.
So when you were growing up with your sister and your parents, what were your daily and weekly commitments to the church like? How much time were you expected to spend as a family involved in church activities?
I would call my family a very liberal extreme of Adventism. So really, we just went to church.
Okay.
And we would perform in music things and do a few after church activities. And of course, we had our church friends and we had our non-church friends. There was always a divide there because we typically only do things on Saturdays with our church friends. And then if they wasn't Saturdays, we do things with our other church friend or our non-church friends. But it really was just the main service from around 9:30, which included a Sabbath school, which is basically Sunday school, and then your main service until about 12:30. There is something that they've carried over, and it's a thing called camp meeting. It's done in I think late June, and that's a week-long series that they have all over the United States, where you basically can go listen to various sermons or attend seminars at a place. It's often a school for a whole week. A lot of people bring their RVs and camp out there, and it's also a time to socialize with other people.
Okay, so it seems like quite a sociable faith to be a part of in terms of the congregation that you were involved with and the upbringing that you had alongside your parents.
Yeah. They also have I'll call it their own Boy Scouts called Pathfinders, And again, that's a way for them to have you only socialize with other Adventists and not socialize outside of it. And it's basically a carbon copy of Boy Scouts.
Right. Okay. So even though you had friends that weren't Adventists, you were still go on these retreats where you're encouraged to only socialize with people inside Adventism.
Yeah, and I suspect Adventists also, they officially frown upon coffee and any caffeine. They very much frown upon alcohol, drug use, and smoking. And I suspect a lot of that, especially the coffee, had to do more with limiting socialization outside of the church rather than any type of health message. I think they got kind of lucky with smoking, but I think a lot of it had to do with creating this system, a lot like Mormonism creates kind of its own world that you belong to.
And your parents were kind of, as you said, liberal enough to kind of be okay with you having friends outside the church that you would be able to go and see on weekends and such.
Yep. And they drink coffee and they eat meat. Adventism's big on a vegetarian message, but it's not official doctrine.
Okay.
So we ate meat, but we didn't eat pork or shellfish. So again, it's like trying to incorporate some of the Jewish traditions. Yet we would have a cheeseburger, and if you know anything about cheeseburger, you can't mix milk and dairy with meat. So it's like, well, wait, you can't have a cheeseburger too and say that you're kosher and following it. But yeah, they pick and choose what to do.
And when you would go to these church meetings on Saturdays, was there a tithe that was expected from congregants?
Yes, but it was never strictly enforced like you see in other religions. I think they have an above average tithe overall, but no one was enforcing it at all. That would be a little too centralized, and probably they would look at it as too Catholic and too much like a central unit trying to tell you what to do. Right.
So are there any other types of fundraising that are associated with the church?
So tithing, but then there's also a kind of offshoots. They have their own kind of overseas aid work. They also have a contingent for political action committee to keep religion out of government, which is interesting. That one is not tax deductible, but people would often give to that. So there are little other ones, but nothing specific.
And what kind of involvement do the pastors have in the lives of people that attend the church? Because in some faiths you see that they have almost this overseeing role where any big decisions in life kind of almost are expected to go through the pastor or to be given the pastor's blessings. So I wonder what Adventism looks like in that sense.
So again, it's set up exactly like Methodism, where the pastor is just sitting on the board. And so you have a church board that votes on things. And that pastor is supposed to help guide them, but they definitely do not have an overriding authority. And in fact, I witnessed several pastors being fired or being forced to move because of various reasons. One was too liberal, the other was too extreme. Others just kind of, I think one just gave up recently at my parents' church. He just was like, yeah, I'm done. And owned a winery in another state with his wife.
Wow.
And quit and moved off. It was like, whoa, that is
bit of a juxtaposition.
So, but I did notice. The pastors have various ones. I had a pastor try to get me on his side when I was a deacon, because I later became a deacon kind of in college, and he was playing a lot of church politics with people, but it really amounted to arguments over whether or not we paid someone to play the piano in church or not, and was paying someone to work on the Sabbath the right thing to do or not. And so, but not it. I wouldn't call them really looking at people's daily lives and calling people out.
Okay. So when you did decide to go to college, that was a decision that you could kind of make on your own?
Yes, and my sister and I both went to public school. Most of the Adventist people that were there went to private Adventist schools, which were very small. I already lived in a really small community, like 50,000. So they spent their time in a narrow group of the same 20 to 30 kids for 20 years.
And would you describe these private schools as boarding schools?
The high school was. It was a boarding school, mixed sex, which had its own interesting side effects. But the other one, the grade school, was not a boarding school.
And do you know of any notable stories specifically to come out of these boarding schools, or were they kind of just generic schooling with just smaller groups of attendees?
Oh, there were plenty of, shenanigans, people sneaking out at night to go see the opposite sex and get together. They had one teacher during break had his girlfriend come over and stay with him overnight. Well, that got around, and they ended up firing him because he had his girlfriend over, and he was a teacher, an adult. And he was pretty liked, but it's kind of like, dude, you should kind of know better at this point. You're in this game.
Are the teachers in the boarding schools, are they Adventists themselves?
Yes, most are Adventist. I can't think of one that wasn't.
Okay. And you and your sister attended public school. So was it normal for you to be around other Adventists, or was it almost sort of multi-faith based in terms of the types of religions your peers were practicing?
It was multi-faith. I would say for the most part, we were surrounded by Catholics and Lutherans that were German and Norwegian descent. But our parents ended up sending us to public school because of all of the drama at the private schools. There was a lot of drama with the private school boards and the teachers, and who was getting a good education and who wasn't. And our parents saw that, and they said, we don't need to get involved in this because we're just going to make enemies either way. If we send our kids to public school, we can stay friends with everyone and not take a side, which was pretty wise on their part, I'll admit. I think now that I don't go to church anymore, they consider it a failure not having put me in there. But when I look back on it, I say that was a very wise decision.
Yeah. I would agree with that as somebody who does not align themselves with a religion themselves. Of course, I will agree with you when you say that it gave you the tools or perhaps the position to be able to take a step back from your faith at some point when you felt like it wasn't something that agreed with you as a person. When you reach that, when you eventually reach that part in your life, because a lot of the people I speak to who can't come and talk on the record because they're still involved in their groups and their faiths, those situations are always very difficult to listen to and sit through, especially when you know there isn't anything you can do to help other than to listen. So your parents are quite interested in this story because they're not the totalitarian figures that we often hear about in these shows. So I wonder what your mum's experience was like. Was she was born an Adventist?
Yes, and this is quite interesting. Her grandparents, they were Germans from Russia, so they're born and raised around Ukraine, Crimea.
Right.
And one was Lutheran, one was Catholic. When they came over from Ukraine, They ended up getting married in secret, and they got married in Montana because you didn't have to have any blood tests for syphilis there. They got married and got their own place, and their relatives heard about this. They came to their house at night and started their house on fire.
Whoa, relatives
Yeah.
of your grandparents?
Yes, I don't know which side, and now it was never said which side, but they started the house on fire. The dogs started barking, woke them up.
Wow.
They got out, and they ended up moving onto an Indian reservation. I mean, in the middle of an Indian reservation.
Whoa, okay. So what, they set the fire because they got married in secret and it was a partnership that wasn't agreed about?
And they were different religions. They were Lutheran and
Of
Catholic.
course.
See? And this is 120 years ago. That was a
Oh
big
my
deal still.
goodness.
So then when the Adventist evangelists came along, and most of the Adventist evangelists went in rural areas because they thought cities were sinful, which is partially why Adventism has stayed so small. If they would have concentrated on cities, it would have been a lot more successful. Well, anyway, when he came with this very anti-Catholic but also anti-Sunday message, that just struck a nerve. Can you imagine a more perfect person than someone who's saying, those people who burned your house down, they are going to bring about the end of the world. They're the mark of the beast. Those are the devil worshippers. It's absolutely perfect. That's exactly what they wanted to hear. So they both were in a hook, line, and sinker. That means my grandmother was born into it. Ironically enough, she married a Catholic, but it wasn't in secret. And then my mother and her siblings were all born into Adventism too.
Wow. So what do you think your grandparents' style of teaching was to kind of bring up a daughter that is quite laid back in terms of following the doctrine strictly?
I think a lot of it had to do with the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s, as well as birth control. My grandmother had very difficult pregnancies, like very difficult, every single one of them. And I believe the last pregnancy she had, the doctor terminated it without her approval to save her life.
Goodness. Oh my goodness.
But that's what you did. You know, you didn't question the doctor back in the day. So my grandmother herself had this liberal streak in her that was very, in the middle of her life, was very pro-choice, pro-woman. And as she got older, she became more rigid, and as she lost her mind, she began to just, fall back on the conspiracies. But that, I think, influenced my mother, who was more strict than my dad. My dad still questions a lot of things because he reads a lot, and he doesn't read just Adventist stuff. He reads a lot. But both of them they always had questions, and they always had one foot out the door, one foot in of the church. They're never fully committed.
That is really interesting insight into your parents in terms of somebody that's born into the church and somebody that kind of finds themselves involved in it later on in life. And I wonder if that speaks to the type of undue influence or thought reform that somebody might experience when they're subjected to this doctrine all their life, as opposed to somebody that voluntarily picks up the doctrine and reads it to teach themselves about something they might be interested in getting involved in on their own free will. That's, very, very interesting to me. Very interesting. So you mentioned briefly about one pastor being fired from your parents' church. So you've been involved. You've been involved in more than one church. If you kind of differentiate your parents and their church is different to your church.
Oh no, I would say it's the same. I probably only attended one other church. There's just a lot of contention between the conservatives and the liberals in that church. So it really took a peacemaker pastor to quell that. And we had one for 11 years. and eventually they pushed him out. But he was able to really make peace between the different sides very well by not being too extreme one way or the other. And he ended up getting replaced with a very evangelical, end of world, screaming on the pulpit one, which, being if you're over there, you're familiar with German Norwegian culture, that does not go over well, that type of thing. Even altar calls, if you know what an altar call is.
No.
An altar call is where like you call people to come up to the altar and profess their faith and whatnot. You just don't do that in a German Norwegian society. You stay in your pew and you're quiet and you listen. That's what you do.
When you talk about that sort of thing, to me, in my mind, it brings about the televangelism and things that you see come out of this Bible Belt area of America.
Yep. And right now I live in the Bible Belt. I live in Oklahoma, so it's a totally different situation here. But up there, they're still bringing that German, Norwegian, Scandinavian practice of Stoicism to church.
And being in that part of the country at the moment, have you noticed a significant difference to what you were used to growing up with Adventism and the types of religions you find yourself coming into contact with now?
Surrounded by, I notice the same type of hypocrisy, but I also notice here in the Bible Belt, they latch themselves onto the politics far more than Adventism would dare to do. Adventism kind of tries to stay neutral a little bit because they always are going to see themselves as being a victim of politics. So if you stay neutral, then you can say, aha, I told you that's going to happen and that could happen. Here, they're very much about government control over people. Even though they complain about it, they really push it, whether that's extreme liquor laws, anti-drug laws, or women's rights issues.
Which is obviously a very big political contention point in that part of America currently.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And it's ironic because this part of America, the Bible Belt, has some of the highest divorce rates, some of the highest child abuse rates, highest obesity rates, and it's just highest drug use rates. It's kind of like, well, I don't think your message is getting across. There's something not working here.
One last word from this month's sponsor, Samuel Knox, and his collection of poetry, prose, and ramblings. From the author himself, read at your own discretion. How to See a Man About a Dog is a collection of experimental short stories, powerful poems, and pulp fiction prose that will take you on a wild, hilarious, and heartbreaking journey. Surrealist short stories, memoiristic poems, and haunting jokes guide you through the wild imagination of emerging writer Samuel Knox's mind. Available to read now wherever you find your books, or follow the link in the episode description to get your copy of Samuel Knox's book, How to See a Man About a Dog, today. And a massive thank you from everyone on Samuel's team for agreeing to partner with the podcast across this month. When you mentioned the impact that COVID has had on bringing about some disputes within the faith, do you think that it's impacted Adventism in terms of numbers as well? Have some people, has the lockdown meant that some people have taken a step away from the church and numbers have decreased, or have they used it to empower their doctrine further in terms of this is this is the start of the end of the world.
Yeah, they haven't officially used that. So the official church doctrine is not anti-vax. The official church doctrine is pro-vaccine because they have all these hospitals they own. How could they be against vaccines if you're churning out these hospitals that are making good profits and be anti-vaccine? It doesn't make sense. But you have that poorer, I think, more ignorant half of Adventism that sees it as that because they're grasping at threads to justify their beliefs in the end of the world. I don't think it's actually affecting the numbers much one way or the other because it is such a schism. You can kind of latch on to both, right? I would say there's probably decreased attendance of church because you don't want to get COVID. That's absolutely been happening, and the COVID numbers have been rising and falling all over, depending on those vaccination rates.
And is there a main message either way to congregants on what they should be doing at the moment? Are they being encouraged to isolate, to use social distancing to get their vaccines, or is the main message overall to continue coming to church gatherings on Saturdays and practicing the faith face to face?
The official message for the church hierarchy is to get vaccinated and to stay away.
Okay.
That's their official message.
Okay. In terms of things like, you spoke briefly about restrictions on certain products that you can consume and can't consume, like alcohol, not mixing meat and dairy. Were there any other restrictions in terms of leisure time for
yes, very much.
Right.
Dancing was frowned upon. Going to the movies frowned upon. I would say most television, Hollywood, those types of things were frowned upon. Not that I was banned from them, but being that the Adventists observe Sabbath from Friday at sunset to Saturday sundown, that kind of cuts you out of a lot of those festivities when you're growing up. Inadvertently, even though my parents didn't ban it, since they didn't want us going out and doing those things, going to the movies, going to dances during those times, we couldn't go to any of them because they weren't available. But I did notice as my sister and I got older, they got less and less extreme as they saw more and more people kind of going off the edge. We also had Branch Davidians come to the church too and try to break people off, and they were recruiting kind of right after David Koresh in Waco, Texas happened too. So that was another kind of schism you saw in the 90s, and it pushed the church, I think, in a more liberal focus. The Branch Davidians really made them look bad. They really did. You had this child molester who was a direct offshoot of Adventism, basically being surrounded and called out. And so I think Adventism had to rebrand a little bit and not be as extreme. But now, 30 years later, the extremes have come back in a very similar way as it has in politics here in the United States. It's really mashed it.
It's interesting when you said that even though your parents didn't restrict you from taking part in certain leisure activities, you are right when you say that Sabbath you observe Sabbath over the primetime social hours. Yep. And I wonder if that, again, is something that's done purposefully.
I think it's trying to literally interpret what the Sabbath was in the Bible. And again, that goes towards trying to interpret as literally as possible, since Jews observed from that time, Orthodox Jews, the Adventists decided to do that. And they didn't initially do that. There was a decision to do that at some point. I don't remember when, but I think they decided at some time in the 19th century, they actually switch it over instead of midnight to midnight, from sundown to sunset.
So you've spoken briefly about diet restrictions and leisure restrictions. What about things like relationships?
Oh, it's definitely anti-homophobic. It's definitely a homophobic religion, anti-trans. It really looks down upon sex before marriage. I remember one pastor talking about how he thought people having sex with one another outside of marriage was creating STDs in and of themselves because they weren't having monogamous sex. And I kind of sat in the back thinking, no, I don't think so. I think some of it might have to do with sex with animals, certainly, but probably not with other people.
So, in some of these groups, if you are to go on a first date with somebody, you actually have a chaperone that comes with you to make sure that there is no kind of messing around that happens on these dates between the two people. Is that something that you've ever come across?
At the boarding schools, they try to enforce that, but it'll kind of come and go. Officially, that's what they like to try to do. I think you saw that recently. You would see that more in the southern United States, but when you get further out to the West Coast, it was far more laissez-faire. Do whatever you want to do.
Right, right. And did you ever find yourself going on any dates and introducing people to your parents?
No, I was too busy studying for most of my high school and middle school.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So talk us through your education. You go to a public school, you are surrounded by people of various faiths. You are kind of not restricted on having friends outside of the church. So apart from observing Sabbath Friday through to Saturday, you do have the opportunity to go out and engage in activities outside of the church with people outside of the church. So you go through public school, and then what does your education look like after that?
Then I went to a 2-year state school and then university, a state university, whereas my sister chose to go to an Adventist college. And my parents didn't really discourage or encourage one over the other. I think my dad wanted cheaper, so he encouraged me to go to state school. And my sister chose, I'm not sure why she chose to go to Adventist school, because a lot of her friends from high school went to the state colleges nearby. And in fact, she seemed to have had a pretty tough time socially at her Adventist college. And a lot of that had to do with not having gone to the high school before, so she was always an outcast. She was never really inside cliques and groups. But myself, for my education, we were always a little bit of an outcast because we didn't participate in sports and extracurricular activities because they all take place on Saturday. So it really limited my high school experience, I would say. It limited what I did. But I did do an awful lot of other things, a lot of hunting and fishing with my father and family, a lot of going out on the farm, boating. And we would do those things on Saturday too, which was a little odd, I think, when you look at it from a strict interpretation. But no one really cared. No one really said, no, you shouldn't do that. They're just like, oh, yeah, it's deer opening season. Of course, you're going to go deer hunting.
Okay. And aside from, well, you mentioned that your father reads a lot, and from what we've spoken about as well, I would assume that you also do read a lot yourself. Are you encouraged to read any particular works that come out of the church? You mentioned amazing facts towards the start of the episode.
Yep. So they have several things. Yep.
Okay, brilliant. Talk us through some of that.
Well, if you go to Sabbath school, they have quarterly lessons, and you end up getting a little book that goes through a a book or a portion of a book of the Bible, and it goes through it phrase by phrase, verse by verse, and they try to look at it from a historical context, but also give you how Adventists interpret those books. And I think they rehash it every decade or so, but they try to go through most of the whole Bible in these quarterly seminars. So what it is, it's a everyday packet where you read a portion, you read in your Bible, and you answer questions about what you read and how you're interpreting it, so that you can discuss it during Sabbath school that next week.
Okay.
There are other books out there, a lot about health message, a lot about being persecuted for some reason, but they're just kind of sold on the side or given away. And there's of course tons of Ellen White stuff for sale. Or not for sale, they'll just give it to you. Patriarchs and Prophets is one where she wrote a whole thing about the Old Testament patriarchs. She has Steps to Christ, which is I would call it the quintessential Adventist book that kind of confirms their Christianity to a degree, and it's quite short. And of course, I call her, what we call it, Opus Dei, would be The Great Controversy. And that's a pretty thick book that goes through why the Pope is the Antichrist and how he'll bring about the end of the world.
Right, okay. And I just, again, like thinking about how prominent and important Ellen G. White is to the birth of Adventism itself, and how women are just seen still as lesser than within the church.
Yep.
And as you mentioned before, the LGBTQIA plus community have no safe place within the faith either. So it seems like the religion likes to position itself as progressive in terms of being pro-modern medicine, much unlike Jehovah's Witnesses, who still practice quite heavily their blood doctrine.
Yeah. Well, and the Adventist health message is big too, that they're the longest lived people in the world because they're vegetarian.
Yeah, so they position themselves as progressive in that sense, but then really don't seem to be quite so progressive in terms of no sex before marriage and no place for women to commit to higher roles within the church itself, which just seems so, as a woman myself, just so bizarre to me. But
that goes back to some of Paul's teachings in the New Testament. Paul had a similar situation go on where he had a rich benefactor, the Apostle Paul. He had a rich female benefactor, and he had a congregation, I think it was in Greece somewhere, and she wanted to be more involved in the church, right? And she was one of his richer benefactors, paid for everything. And he ended up being one that kind of set down, I think what a lot of religions still follow, that, women aren't meant to be leading the church in that way. That's more reserved for men, partially because, he's Jewish. He's following the priests. He's not going to say something that's going to be contrary to that 2,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And even today, in some of these new religious movements like Jehovah's Witnesses, when women do come to approach the front of the congregation, they're asked to wear a certain thing on their head to basically distinguish them from the men that are in front of the congregation, which is just so strange for me to think about. It makes me think of like, wear this duncer's hat and go and sit in the corner kind of thing. Like it's a symbol that basically just confirms to everybody that you are lesser than or different to the men that are leading the church service that day. I don't know. It makes me.
But again, that comes to another verse from Paul saying that women should keep their heads covered.
Yes. Yeah.
So you can literally point to the Bible and say, "Yep, that's what you're supposed to do."
It's unfortunate that, like you said before, in the 1930s, this new piece of doctrine can be agreed on. And then earlier you also said something about a certain type of meat that people still eat because, vegetarianism is encouraged, but it's not written in the doctrine.
No, it's not official doctrine.
But it might well be in a couple of months' time if they just decide to add things in as and when.
Yeah, I just doubt it will, because that would not be interpreting the Bible very literally to say you should be vegetarian. However, there were people in church that would say such things as Jesus wasn't truly divine because he ate meat, which is just kind of like, wow, that's quite a statement to make.
There really is. Well, there really are so many different ways people can sit down and interpret the text, and we've seen that because so many different faiths exist around the same text. I wonder if there is a number, or if it's impossible to even know the exact number because different fringe movements are setting themselves up all the time. There was an interview I did just the other day with somebody who was from a new apostolic movement, of somebody that broke away from his church and started his own mini faith where he interpreted the doctrine in his own way and managed to get some followers to come and live with him in this industrial block. And he was just some random guy with a little bit of background in preaching who had decided that he had found the true way to interpret the Bible. So it's really fascinating, and I don't think there probably is a very accurate number on how many different ways the text has been interpreted by various people. And that leads us into quite nicely this section about the Branch Davidians, where, if my memory serves me right, there was a guy called Hutef and his wife Florence who began reading the Adventism text and deciding that it didn't quite add up for them. So they went off and wrote some things called the Shepherd's Rod, or they named themselves the Shepherd's Rod. They
named themselves the Shepherd's Rod. They set a new date for the end of the world. I think it was 1955 or something. And of course, that didn't pan out. But they kind of took almost, I call it a bit of a Jehovah's Witness slant at it, in saying they thought a new Messiah would arise, and that Jesus wasn't the Messiah. There would be a new one, and just to be ready. I have an uncle who was almost joined them in the upper Northwest. And then in my own church, one of the surgeons in the church sold everything he had, and this was after Waco, to join a commune up in Canada with his wife and family.
After Waco as well. Oh my goodness.
After Waco. Yeah, and I went to the auction because he had a lot of hunting stuff there. So me and my dad went to his house auction to whatever. And of course, my parents thought that was crazy. It's just like, you're crazy. But when I look at it, I'm like, no, is it? Is it that crazy if you're going to really look at it?
Absolutely. And it speaks volumes to this message that we always try and discourage about the air quotes type of person that can be seduced, compelled, coaxed, coerced into these types of high control demand groups, because he was a surgeon and had probably had to study higher education for 10 plus years to gain that qualification and that position. So when a lot of people without knowledge or insight into these types of groups come forward to say, oh, well, you'd have to be an idiot to join a group like that. This is a perfect example of why that's not true. So it's always important to draw attention to those things. But you have Hutef and Florence, and they call themselves the Shepherd's Rod. And then eventually Hutef dies and Florence continues things without him. And then you've got Benjamin Roden who comes along. And I can't remember if he branches off from the Shepherd's Rod and creates the Branch Davidians, or if he changes Shepherd's Rod to the Branch Davidians.
I think he branches off because there was an armed conflict that they got into. But I know David Koresh, he was sleeping with the woman you were talking about. He was in his 20s, she was in her 60s. And there was some thought that I recently was reading that if she became pregnant at that age in her 60s, that would be the new Messiah, because that would be like a sign from God, kind of like Sarah and Abraham.
Yeah, I mean, just Hutef kind of proclaiming that there would be a new Messiah paves the way for somebody like David Koresh to come forward and create the situation that he did. So there's that upside down pyramid that I was kind of talking about before, where you have Ellen G. White's Seventh-day Adventism at the top, with loads of, well, I'm not sure if loads is the right word to use, but a few people branching away from her doctrine to create their own movements. And one of those is Shepherd's Rod. And from there, a few groups branch off. And one of those is the Branch Davidians, which is created by Benjamin Roden and his wife Lois. And when Benjamin Roden dies, Lois meets this charismatic man named Vernon Howell, who becomes David Koresh and creates this very cult-like environment that has become infamous throughout history and is one of the first things that people will talk about when they use cults in that commercial sense of the word. Charles Manson, Jonestown, David Koresh, and the Branch Davidians kind of cult description. So can you just tell the listeners who maybe aren't familiar with the Branch Davidians or David Koresh's group of Branch Davidians specifically, what happened with that situation?
Well, he had convinced people to all live on a commune. He had convinced all the women to become kind of his wives as well as their daughters. And he was sleeping with underage girls, had a lot of illegal firearms. But what, of course, the government was most concerned about was that they weren't paying their taxes. And so instead of doing the smart thing, the ATF and FBI, I guess he used to go jogging every day, and they could have just nabbed him then. That's the rumor I've always heard. They could have just pulled up in a van and got him. They decided to surround the compound and wait him out. Well, this ended up playing right into Koresh's hands, because here he had a militarized government waiting out these people. You could literally say, hey, they've come to get us. This is the end of days. And the government eventually brought in what I'll call an armored personnel carrier to try to breach the walls after some other failed breaches, because the Davidians were very well armed. They had a lot of heavy weaponry. They brought in a tank, essentially, and shot in some tear gas, and the whole compound started on fire. People say it started on fire because Koresh wanted to. He put gasoline everywhere. But of course, a lot of other people say the government killed them all. It's all the government's fault. It's still pretty controversial to this day. You know,
there's definitely a conspiracy that involves that situation itself, with some people saying that it was the ATF and the FBI responsible for causing the fire itself, and there were a high number of casualties. I think around 80 odd people died in total, and it's the longest standing siege in the history of in American history, I believe, between the FBI and a group of and a civilian group. I think to this day still the longest siege. I think it went on for almost a month, like 3 or 4 weeks or something along those lines.
So maybe longer. They were prepared. They had food and water and generators and everything.
And you can listen. Actually, I think there are some recorded segments in a documentary about Waco, and it does highlight the conspiracy actually, and the evidence that shows that the fire itself was started not by Koresh but by law enforcement. And there's a few video clips where you can listen to Koresh actually speaking to the person in charge of what do they call it when is it the negotiator? So they have the negotiator and they have Koresh. Absolutely. And you can hear Koresh speaking, and he just heavily recites the doctrine that he has been evangelizing to his members, who he wakes up in the middle of the night, and then he would play really loud music, and he would only let people get sort of 1 to 2 hours sleep, and then they would have to do training regimes. And it turned out that a lot of the people were living without working toilet systems, there was no heating, they didn't have a lot of food left, and they were rationing everything. And this was before the siege as well, so the situation itself was pretty dire before the siege itself took place. But for anybody that's interested in learning about some very public forms of coercive control that we now know about because of the testimonies from victims that survived the siege in Waco, where David Koresh did actually die, then people should go and look that up and research it. I have covered it on the Patreon page, but there's plenty of public information for anybody that would like to learn more. There's a lot on record about the types of manipulation and coercion that these types of charismatic leaders might use against their followers, and some of it's really heartbreaking. But as you said, it's a bad reflection on Adventism itself, because this is a group that is a direct branch of Seventh-day Adventism. So it makes sense that they've tried to distance themselves from that group.
And Adventism had prided itself on being conscientious objectors in World War I, World War II, and Vietnam. That was a big part of the message, was conscientious objectors. So this really flies in that face, in that history.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned as well that it's a group that still exists today.
Yes, there's still Branch Davidians out there. Yeah.
That's so interesting. I find that very interesting. But then there's still members of Aum Shinrikyo, which now call themselves Aleph, which I find really interesting as well, after everything that they did with the Tokyo subway attacks and the sarin gas and everything. So you go on to college. At what point do you decide that you no longer want to observe Sabbath? You don't want to attend church services. You're going to sit down with your mum and dad and tell them, that you no longer wish to be a practicing Adventist.
I would say during the 2008 recession, when I lost my job and started a new job, I had started reading so there's a King James Bible, but there's also a Catholic Bible, which has the Maccabean texts, which kind of fill the gap between the Jews' Babylonian exile and Christ time. And I started reading the Gnostic books that weren't included in the Bible, but were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I read the Quran, the Book of Mormon.
Wow.
I read some of the Buddhist ones, and I was like, this is all trying to manipulate people for certain individuals' power. It has nothing to do with reality and truth. And even Buddhist, I was kind of like, yeah, I guess technically you could say we're all reincarnated all the time, since we eat other things and we're built of stuff and we get rebuilt all the time. But that's when I started like not going at all. In college, I had started to drink a little bit. And then once I started dating a woman, that's when I really confronted my parents, because that was at the time where they had a controversial pastor who was really pushing them that it was the end of the world. Everyone needed to be a vegetarian. They need to go out and try to evangelize as much as possible. And I really pushed back on them. I said, how can you sit here and belong to this? This is nuts. You're going to end up in a situation like David Koresh, like Jonestown, if you keep going with this, because they'll complain about this guy. And I'm like, well, quit giving them money then. Quit attending. And they've never really quit. A part of it's kind of, they have their friends there, and all their friends are kind of liberal too. Most of them drink. And so it's kind of like this only social club they've had. And, now that they're in their 70s, where else are they going to go? They're kind of set in their ways.
And that's often what happens with these insular communities. They create these environments so that people don't need to go outside of the church to look for things like socializing, friendship groups, activities, and people to do, hiking with or hunting with, and these types of things that you mentioned doing. But luckily your parents seem to have, as you said, liberal friends that are aligned with your parents in how relaxed they are in terms of church commitments and things like, not adhering to enforced vegetarianism and things like that. But unfortunately, there are types of faith groups that we hear about on this show where these insular communities are very high in demand, and parents, family members, and friends expect the guests that come on to speak on this show to only adhere to those principles and practices, no matter how strict they are, or no matter how much they stop people from having access to friends and activities outside of church activities and church attendance. So, and also with things like Mormonism as well, their communities are so insular that if you need to get your roof retiled, you would only hire a Mormon roofing company. So if you own a Mormon roofing company and you live in a Mormon community, you can't risk leaving your church or leaving your faith, because then you would have no business and nobody would use your roofing company because you're no longer a Mormon.
So there's a little bit of that in Adventism. Because they won't work on Saturday, there tends to be a lot of self-employed people. But that also, interesting statistic I was looking up once, some of the poorest parishioners in the United States are Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses. And it doesn't take long to figure it out. If you're not going to work on Saturdays, you're probably not going to be the boss's favorite when he absolutely needs you.
So it makes sense for people to be self-employed. So you sit down with your parents, you tell them that you've decided that you're no longer going to practice the faith. What's their reaction to that piece of news?
I think my mom cried for a while and was like, but again, her friends were kind of like, none of our kids are Adventists either. And she had more of a fit when I started dating a black girl, because I'm married to a black woman.
Okay.
That was like the whole world was ending. And I think some of her friends had to sit her down and say, you're not going to have a relationship with your son if you keep acting like this. This is the time period we live in. You can't act like this.
No.
Whereas my dad, I'm not sure he was really that surprised because he's kind of half in it anyway. Not really sure why he keeps going in. But we're definitely reconciled. I think they hope I'm going to join again or come back. At least my mom, kind of. But they're also seeing all of the struggles my sister's having in it, and some of the mistakes she's making of her children, or I should say, how she's indoctrinating them to a point where they're going to be weird, and they're not only going to be weird once they get out of the house or once they get to high school. They're going to branch out to things that may be self-destructive. And I saw that a lot too. These kids that were in church school their whole lives, half of them don't belong to church, and of those half, a lot of them went very extreme when it came to drug use, sexuality. They just kind of went way off the kind of normal deep end, and they kind of backfired on all of the parents. And I definitely see that happening with my niece and nephew because they are so restricted in their life.
What was your sister's reaction when you told her that you'd no longer be going to church or practicing?
Oh, I questioned her why she did. I was like, why are you believing in this? You have a Bible that condones slavery. You have verses that condone rape. Why would you ever sit here and belong to it? And she just started crying and never really responded. But I don't think she's also read the whole Bible or any other books. She just takes it, well, whatever is fed to her. She's never looked into anything herself.
And that's why we always promote critical thinking and research on this show as well, because it's so important to be informed as much as possible. And using the internet is also a great tool for that, now that people have open access to things like the ex-Adventist subreddit, which we've mentioned a couple of times on the show, which is a great tool. And an interesting question that I wanted to go back to: if you were to rejoin the church and you joined with your wife, would she be welcomed as a member of the community if she is like a person of color, or would she not be accepted into the church herself?
Oh, she'd be accepted, but the church is definitely there are segregations. There's normally a black church and a white church in most of the United States, and it's kind of been the same with their schools too. They only really desegregated their schools and churches in 1946, but there's still a decent amount of segregation. My wife's also Catholic, so I don't know why she'd ever join something like that.
Yeah. So basically, a summary of our conversation today is that Adventism is basically lots and lots of the us versus them part of Stephen Hassan's bite model, where there's Adventism versus other faiths, and Adventism versus atheism, and Adventism versus Saturday or Sunday worship.
It's Sunday. It's Adventism versus Sunday. That's the big one.
And then there's anti-vax and pro-vax, and liberal versus conservative, and anti-Ellen G. White and pro-Ellen G. White. And then there's even segregation between different ethnicities within the religion as well. So it's really fascinating that Adventism is at war with other faiths who don't see it as a true Christian religion, but it's also at war with itself because there's so many conflicting ideals within the movement at the moment.
Yes, and a lot of that has to do with it being decentralized, like Methodists are. They want to get as far away from a Catholic-like organizational structure as they could. And to some point, that's been their detriment because they don't have a core hierarchy to push them in a direction, which allows them to flow in all kinds of directions.
Yeah. And that's what happened with with the Branch Davidians and how they came into existence. As we talked about, that trickle down effect that came from Seventh-day Adventists at the top all the way down. And it's almost like Adventism doesn't have its own core identity because it's taken so much of other things and mashed them together, but also is kind of, we encourage vegetarianism, but it's not in the doctrine, so it's kind of up to you. So it's leaving a lot of space there for free thinking, basically. But also what that does in the same sense is that it's not giving Adventism the identity that some of these other faith-based groups have that we speak about on the show. And because of that, almost it makes it ripe for other people to just come along and say, well, I am Adventist, but I'm kind of Adventist and believe in this, so I'm going to rename my group Casey's Jamboree.
Yep.
So one of the last questions I have before I ask you if you think there's anything we've missed is, what advice do you have for others who may be thinking about leaving their own faith-based group?
And I read through that the ex-Adventist subreddit, and I really feel for some of the younger people who are still financially dependent upon their parents. And I don't know what to tell them, especially if they're gay or trans and they're teenagers still in the house. I guess I tend to go towards not being controversial and creating a lot of friction. And I would say wait till you are independent, but definitely strive to be independent as soon as you can. And a lot of them, they're looking at, well, nobody's going to pay for my college. And I go, you can always join the military. They'll pay for your college and you'll get benefits. That's always an option. You can also take out student loans. You should get out, especially if it's being unhealthy. But yeah, waiting till you're 18 plus or waiting till you're financially dependent, I can see doing that. But if you're still dependent upon your parents and you're going to bring something up like, oh, I'm gay or I'm into something that isn't kosher to them, I would really encourage to wait till you have your own independence, because it could turn out really bad. Living on the street and being homeless is not going to be better than living a lie for another year or two. I mean, lots of people live lies. You can do it for a little bit more, but I do feel for them. If somebody, though, I see others where one person's Adventist and the other's not, and the one who's not it's really bothering them, but they're married and they have kids. Whew. Huh. I don't know what advice I can give them. You can try to convince them, I guess. You could be like, hey, let's read this history of Christianity together or watch a documentary about it. But it's pretty hard to unconvince someone when they've been in something so long.
And I wonder how your sister kind of ended up on such a different path to you, when I'm assuming that your parents had the same approach with the both of you, and yet she seems to have engrossed herself further into the faith, whereas you took a step back and said, and you went on and read and researched, and maybe that's what the key difference is.
I think ignorance is bliss for her, but I think I ended up getting a spouse that was raised by a single mother, and she was looking for stability in the relationship, right? My sister found a spouse whose father was a self-admitted alcoholic. And so the Adventist message of no alcohol, I think, appealed to him. So then that helped push them both back in it.
Right.
His parents also have a lot of health issues that are really caused by their lifestyle choices, sedentary lifestyle, even a lot of processed foods. I think that's pushed them more in it too. And after she had kids, it's like something goes off in some people's brains where they kind of get more extreme. And I noticed this amongst my cousins too. Whereas before they had kids, they were pretty cool. You could talk to them about a bunch of stuff. After they have kids, you can't hardly hold a conversation with them above an elementary level because they don't want to expose their children to something else or say something offbeat. And it's like, okay, so you're just going to forego being an adult then for 20 years?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'd say that might have been it too. Once she had kids, it really pushed her over the edge.
Mm-hmm. I had a discussion recently with a guest on the show who talked about how some high demand religious groups almost write basically a guidebook on how you're supposed to raise your children. And I think a lot of the time it's easier for parents to give themselves over to a guide that tells them how they should do things with their children, because raising children is so hard and it's such a huge responsibility and there's no perfect way to do it. But then if your religion is saying this is how you raise your kids and it's taking that pressure off of you, I can see why sometimes that might happen when somebody is already aligned with a faith-based group like Adventism. So maybe that played a part with your sister as well.
Somewhat, but you have some of Ellen White's comments about raising children include not teaching them to read until they're 10.
Oh my goodness.
And I have some cousins who have taken that literally. So they have like 6 kids and they're not teaching them to read till they're 10.
No, that's got to be another way of taking critical thinking away from people.
Exactly. That's exactly why you would do it. There's no other reason to. My sister has not done that, but they're also both educated in the medical profession. They're sending their kids to daycare. Now they're sending their kids to an Adventist school they've tried to set up. But she's more taking the stance of not letting them eat any meat, almost raising them vegan almost, and not having them exposed to any type of media, which means whenever they see media, they're like zombies. They can't stop from watching the TV.
Yeah.
You can't pull them away. And that was the way my cousins were too. They weren't allowed to see that. And you still can't pull them away from TV. They're just addicted.
There's also that difficulty as well that in those types of experiences that we have also discussed on the show previously, where as these children get older, they may decide themselves, as you said before, to move away from the religion. They may get themselves involved in dangerous situations because they have never been exposed to the world outside of their insular communities. But also then if they do decide to go to college and interact with people outside of the faith who have had exposure to things like music and films that the church might not necessarily condone people watch or entertain themselves with, there could be that difficulty in socializing when people say, oh, who's your favorite music artist, or who's your favorite film director? And a lot of the guests on this show that had never heard of Beyonce or Justin Timberlake or had never been to the cinema or had never watched Saturday morning television, who then have to have those awkward conversations where they have to explain why they don't know who those people are or what that type of alcoholic drink is or why they've never been out dancing before. So again, that could also hinder social communication with some of these children that are growing up so restricted.
And I think not only the social communication, it hinders their ability to collaborate and to be successful as an adult. I think that's partially why Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses are some of the poorest parishioners in the United States. They don't have those abilities to talk about those shared experiences that the rest of society has.
Yeah, yeah. And also goes back to the pressure of leaving a high demand religious group, not just things like, oh, I can't carry on with my roofing business if no one will hire me because I'm no longer in the church. There's also that, how do I make friendships outside of the church if I've only ever known people inside? So there are all these difficulties, but basically what we've determined from your perspective is that independence is key, whether that is independence from your parents, independence from the religion, independence financially, as quickly as possible and as soon as you can, try and gain some level of independence so that you can distance yourself from the religious group at some point. Read as much as you can, build on your critical thinking. And for anybody that would like to read stories or interact with other community members, people who are physically in, mentally out, people who are physically out, mentally out, all these different types of community members. There are almost 5,000 members in the ex-Adventist subreddit. So I'll put a link in the episode description, but that is r/ex-Adventist for anybody who would like to go and visit that. It's a very active subreddit as well, and it's very supportive.
Yeah. There's more members in it than the Adventist subreddit.
Which is, that speaks volumes, doesn't it? That speaks volumes.
That's really ironic there.
It's also interesting that there is an Adventist subreddit, because I'm sure that in a lot of the congregations, it's discouraged for people to go onto the internet and freely use it for things like social engagement or researching Adventism and finding out that some doctrines were introduced in the 1930s. But there we go. So my last question to you, Jared, it is, do you think there's anything that we have missed that is important to relay to the listeners before we say goodbye today?
What has life been like since I left? That would be one of your questions.
Yes.
I don't think I answered. It's been far more relaxing to not think about the end of the world, to not think about church, to not have church to go to over the past 13 years, than having that over my head, as well as not being longing to getting involved with church politics. And I think that wouldn't go just for Adventism. I think any church, if you get involved with politics, you're going to see the dirty side of things. Not having those, how do I put it, things to do on the weekend and allowing yourself to think outside of that, it's really great. Right now, I'm an atheist, and it doesn't bother me at all to think about not existing, especially after watching some shows. In fact, some British shows like that Netflix one, Black Mirror.
Yes, Black Mirror is a great one,
where I realized even if you did have eternal life, you could be in a situation you don't want to be in for eternity. That could be far worse. That was one of those situations where I went, I never thought about death like that. Okay, I guess I'm okay with dying now.
Is that the episode with the two women in the hospital?
That's one of them. There's also one where they capture this supposed criminal's mind, and they keep executing him over and over and over again in a museum.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I know which episode you mean. Yep.
And then there's another episode with the actor that played Don Draper, where he gets out of a man how he murdered his ex-wife's child, but he ends up trapping that man's mind in the situation where he murdered the child over and over for 10,000 years.
There's also the one where the woman neglects her child and she's putting it in like a simulation where people come. It's one of the earlier episodes, but basically she has to go through this event over and over where people come to harass her about neglecting her children as well. So yeah, Charlie Brooker's got a very dark mind, but he does pose some very important social questioning and social commentary, especially on things like technology as we move forward.
Yeah, that was something that, you know, when you go from something that talks about having eternal life and being happy forever, and then seeing a completely different vision of eternity, that really gave me a chance to sit down and think about it far differently than I ever thought about it my whole life. I really enjoyed that thought process.
And I'm sure that he'd be really excited to hear that, because surely that's the entire purpose of some of the content that he writes and releases. So that's a very interesting way to look at it. Absolutely. So we've talked a lot about this has been a great introduction to Adventism, and I do have another interview with somebody in a week's time where hopefully we'll talk about some different experiences. I think that they may have been a bit more involved in church activities than you and your family were, so there'll be a different perspective to add to this introduction to Adventism that we've had today. But we've basically talked about where it came from, how it's changed, how the communities are conflicting within the faith at the moment, and the differences that reading up and researching or burying your head in the sand can have on where you end up with your ideals and commitments to the church later on in life. So it's been a very interesting and insightful interview, and I have really enjoyed speaking with you today, Jared, and having my first interview on Seventh-day Adventism. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
You're welcome. And there are some other topics. Being in the Bible Belt, we have a lot of interesting characters around here, and one you may want to look into at some point is this guy named Oral Roberts.
Ooh.
He founded a university here. I live right by it, and he's one of the first televangelist faith healers. But his history, as well as all the shenanigans that his children have gotten into as they've inherited his empire, is quite interesting.
Really?
I think you really love looking into that. Oh, yeah.
Oral Roberts, one of the first televangelist faith healers. That's that's like a clickbaity title for somebody like me. That is. So I will definitely go and look. That up. That's fantastic. Awesome. So thank you so much for that, Jared. And I am going to enjoy listening back to our episode while I edit it, and then hopefully we can release it in a few weeks' time and get some feedback from the listeners.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you so much, Jared. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Bye.
Take care. Bye. That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or get in touch on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been the Cult Vault.